Hello everyone, welcome to the Safety, Culture and Climate webinar series. My name's Tristan Casey and I'll be your host for today's session. So welcome back to those of you that have been with us for the whole journey. We're up to number 4 out of 5 webinar sessions so far, and greetings to those of you who have joined us just for today. So our focus today is on construction. It's our last industry-specific session. Before we move on in a couple of weeks to our concluding webinar, we'll bring all those threads together and focus on a more, practical approach to preparing, implementing and understanding a safety, culture and climate assessment in your business. So you can look forward to that. But enough about the next session. Today we've got some great speakers, really excited to bring to you some thought leaders in this space. We've got Professor Helen Lingard from RMIT University, and she's also the Director of the Centre for Construction Work, Health and Safety Research. A very prolific researcher and is doing a lot in this space over the past 20 years or so. We've also got Mr. Steve Keogh. He's a Senior Safety Advisor with GrowCon. And is actually involved in the Parklands project down on the Gold Coast. So he's living and breathing this stuff on a daily basis and has some great expertise and experiences in safety culture and what GrowCon's done to build a safety culture in their business. So we'll hear from those guys a little bit more further on in the session. With today's recording, that'll be available in a few weeks. We'll get that up along with some resources that you can look at. So the resources there will, summarize the insights from today's session, provide some great links too. We've come up with, I think, 5 or 6 different resources that you can download in addition to today, some industry publications and things that you can use yourselves out there in the workplace. So today's series is brought to you by the Safety Leadership at Work program, which is an initiative of the Workplace Health and Safety Board. So a little bit about myself as well. So I'm a Principal Advisor with the Leadership and Culture Unit over at Workplace Health and Safety and part of the team that's delivering this Safety Leadership at Work program. Now, in terms of, opening up the session today, we've, described safety culture in different ways, and we've done that on purpose because we wanted to try and give you a slightly different explanations or different ways of looking at it throughout the different series. So if you are interested in going back and looking at those recordings will help you do that. Now, what we're focused on today is more about, I suppose, the process by which culture starts to influence our outcomes, our health and safety outcomes. So one way we can look at it is from the inside out. So how does culture start to percolate up and actually have an impact or an effect on our safety and health performance? One of the ways we could think about safety culture, and this is where research and practice is going, is to think of it as part of the broader organizational culture. And we'll return to that concept in a little while. Now, the first place that culture kind of manifests or appears is probably in the safety climate, which is overlapping but a slightly different concept. You could think of safety climate as the general atmosphere of safety within an organization, the shared perceptions of whether safety is valued and a priority and important. This environment then influences our actions, so the safety behaviours of leaders and workers out there in the field, which of course has an impact on our external environment. Now, the other way of looking at it is from the outside in. So how can we start to maybe influence that underpinning foundation or thinking about safety? How can we start to influence that safety culture? Well, the way we do it is through our actions. So leaders can start to change the style of their leaderships. They can do tangible things like investing more resources in safety training programs, maybe starting to measure safety culture and climate in their organization with signals of priority. Over time, this will influence the climate, and then over a further amount of time start to impact that shared way of thinking, those deep-seated values and beliefs for the safety culture. Now, something we might forget about sometimes is that the external environment can actually influence all these different elements separately. An example in construction might be perhaps a subcontractor with their own safety climate and culture, actions of other leaders in our projects or our workplaces that people interpret and take meaning from, which can have some unintended consequences. Helen will expand on that concept when she talks through some of her research studies and just the general interconnectedness of the construction environment when it comes to safety culture. So we could say then that one of the goals of our safety culture initiatives is to firstly increase the amount of overlap that safety culture has with that broader organizational culture. We want safety to be a core part of the way that people think about and do business within any organization. The other goal might be to critically examine that safety culture, ask people to share their way of thinking and look at the way people behave as well, and develop a picture as to how healthy is that safety culture. And through various actions and initiatives, we can start to make that culture a healthy one and a positive one for health and safety. So let's go now to our industry and look at construction specifically. So just setting the scene here before we hear from Helen and Steve. So there's been a lot of good work actually done in construction in terms of injury and illness statistics. So you can see some up here from Safe Work Australia. There's been roughly a 30% decrease across the nation and even in Queensland as well over the past few years. There is, despite this positive work, I guess there is still some stuff to do, some work to invest here, with construction still being among the highest in terms of those injury outcomes. So by investing in safety culture and climate, we can continue that positive progress. Now, construction is a major contributor to our nation's prosperity. It's a core part, a core industry that generates a lot of activity and wealth for us. It also employs a large slice of the workforce, which means that construction companies do have this ability to influence the workplaces and safety outcomes of a large bunch of people across Australia, which is great to improve those injury outcomes. Now, the current situation in construction, there's perhaps a period of decline where, you know, it is tough financially. There's maybe not as many projects as there were, or profitability could be challenging. But the future looks positive, with some improvements coming along online in 2017 with infrastructure projects, for example. We've also got the city of Brisbane, which is experiencing a massive period of growth, and in terms of the stats, we're looking at maybe an 80% increase in the size of that city and over 4 million residents coming into that area. So what it means for health and safety is that construction is going to get busier, probably going to become more competitive. The projects are likely going to be more complex as well as we start to build, you know, high density urbanised environments with lots of different subcontractors coming online to complete those projects. Now, this is well recognised by the state, for example, by initiatives like Construction Q. Now, this was a forum held late last year whereby over 200 people from industry and government got together to think through, you know, where is the industry headed, what challenges are we likely to experience, and what can we do about it right now to anticipate some of those issues. So as you can probably guess, health and safety came up as a core thread or area of focus moving forward, and a particular mention of safety, leadership and culture, recognition that these elements are important for a safe construction industry in the future. So some of the things that came up or issues that the industry needs to think about are, you know, the increasing role of technology. How do we modernise safety systems and move away from paper-based things? How do we get clear about our legal obligations with health and safety and make sure our workforce knows about them? And how do we build, I guess, a trusting environment founded on positive relationships that helps all those subcontractors, you know, contribute ideas, improve safety, and generally be part of that general project culture. So this blueprint has clearly cemented leadership and culture as an area of focus in Queensland moving forward. So I do encourage you to check out that Construction Q resource if you are curious about where that attention's being directed. Now, just before we go to Helen, I just want to walk you through a brief case study. This one I picked out because it's a real good example of where there were some really significant health and safety challenges, but unfortunately they were able to turn that around through a focus on safety culture and climate in particular. So some of you may have heard of the Las Vegas City Centre project, massive development over in the US. You can see some of the stats up here now, over 7,000 people on site at its peak, huge value there. So obviously the commercial side of it, perhaps putting some pressure on the project. The unfortunate part was that there were 12 fatalities over a period of 18 months, which really triggered a lot of media attention and sort of pressure from unions, for example, to get this sorted. When they, I guess, went in and looked at the situation there, what they found were a few contributing factors that probably started to impact health and safety. You can see some of those up on the screen now. A couple of them fairly pertinent to the situation, so you could see there the massive bonus that perhaps the clients were putting in place for an on-time completion, combined with things such as just the high complexity of the project and the massive sort of, I guess, interconnectedness of the different subcontractors on site. All these different factors likely contributed to that situation, that environment, that you know, where leaders were perhaps focused on the wrong things or not hearing from the ground and their concerns in a genuine way. Now, I'll just pop up a poll here for you to have a look at. So considering all those factors that were at play within that environment there, what do you think were some of the outcomes of that? So you can see some up there: poor quality control, for example, poor safety attitudes, lack of communication. You can just go ahead and tick on the ones that you think were relevant given that context that they were operating in there. Now, as you're going through, you're probably thinking, well, maybe all of these apply. You know, I could perhaps relate it back to projects and see how that environment may even be happening in some of my workplaces. And you'd be right. All of these different factors here were relevant for the Las Vegas project. So you could sort of see how that general environment is going to start creating a safety culture that's not conducive to, I guess, good positive outcomes. Now, the solution stage, what they did here was that they, I guess, invested in university researchers, people similar to Helen, I suppose, coming in and really helping that leadership team to diagnose what was going on from a safety culture and climate perspective. Now, this was a real change for the project environment because they were used to perhaps not really hearing or seeing from leadership. Their views and concerns and opinions maybe could have felt like they weren't valued or considered at all. So this was a real change in terms of the culture, just that process of actually going in and talking to people and hearing what they had to say. So the solution that they put in, you can see some of the recommendations simplified there, of course, that people came up with. Things such as not only looking at leadership and behaviour, but also the systems that they'd established as well, like the KPIs or the ways that they manage performance of people on the site. Important too was a focus on induction and training. So when people were getting onto that site, there was no real consideration of safety culture and sort of expectations that the project lead had around how to establish that environment that was conducive to safety. So again, if you are curious to learn more about that case study, that's in our resource pack. You can go and read that and see the specific actions that they took to improve. So enough from me. I'd love to hear a little bit from Helen now, who's been doing a lot of research in this space. So Helen, I know you've been in the construction space for a long time. I'm just wondering if you could share with us a bit of a background or a short history of what you've been working on over the years.
Sure, yeah. I started my career in construction health and safety in Hong Kong. I studied at the university there, and when I graduated, I went to work on some large infrastructure construction projects in Hong Kong, including the Tsing Ma Bridge and the International Airport at Chek Lap Kok. So I actually came from a practical industry background, but when I moved to Australia in 1997, I took up a position as an academic. And during my 10 years at RMIT, the last 10 years, I've spent a lot of time building up a research team that's done a whole heap of work at looking at workers' health and safety in the construction industry. We've done work looking at work-life balance, health and well-being. We've done some work around health and safety culture and climate assessments. And we also do quite a lot of work around safety and design. And I'm going to draw on all of those three areas of research in the presentation as we go forward.
Thanks for sharing, Helen. It's really great that you're able to devote some time to us today, and all those experiences will be very, very helpful for people. So you can go ahead and take us through your slides.
Thank you. A few years ago, in 2014, my research group were asked to undertake a review of health and safety culture for the Australian Constructors Association, and they asked us to look at different levels of culture and the way that those different levels impacted on workers' health and safety in the construction industry. So we actually looked at 4 different levels. We looked at national and industry cultures, we looked at the organisational level, we looked at project-specific cultures, and right down to work groups and what goes on at that very, very micro level between workers, their co-workers and their supervisors. And all of these different levels all had some very interesting cultural characteristics that impacted on workers' health and safety. But a bit of background information about construction industry culture. We examined the culture of the industry and the way that that industry culture impacted on workers' health and safety. And we found that there were some really important characteristics of the industry culture that had a significant impact on workers' health and safety. It's a predominantly male workforce, and the male-dominated culture has a sort of can-do attitude and cultural characteristic that does tend to attract, accept and retain workers who are inclined to take risks. We've also got a very complex multi-level system of contracting and subcontracting, and this is actually associated with people working very, very long hours, sometimes taking shortcuts, sometimes working in spite of being injured, and these economic pressures that apply through this contracting situation can also be detrimental. We've found obviously that the industry has a very strong long work hours culture, and this impacts people's work-life balance, and that does in fact have implications for the way that they work and ultimately their health and safety. So industry culture is important because the broader industry culture serves to regulate the behaviour of member organisations within it, because it really does establish expectations about how things are done in a particular industry, and that in some circumstances can be a barrier to change. At an organisational level, we often talk about how we often talk about safety culture as though it's something that an organisation has or it doesn't have. But there's a different way of looking at the way that culture impacts on safety, and that is to see safety as an outcome of the broader organisational culture. So in fact, the broader organisational culture, which is characterised by competitive pressures to minimise costs, risk shifting down the subcontracting chain, the creation of intensely tight project schedules, the gender inequalities and inflexible work schedules that define the industry, and indeed the adversarial industrial relationships that can arise, all are aspects of the organisational environment and culture that can in fact have an impact then on workers' health and safety. So this view of seeing health and safety as an outcome of the broader organisational culture was one of the things that we saw as important when we wrote the report for the Australian Constructors Association. The other aspect of the construction industry that I think makes it important to recognise that culture is actually quite challenging to develop is that the construction industry delivers work in complex supply networks. So projects are temporary coalitions of different firms that come together to deliver a particular project over a limited period of time. When the project ends, the team disperses. And in that context, it's very hard to form a cohesive culture or a set of shared values and practices in relation to anything, not least health and safety. Because some companies, as this diagram shows, may in fact be partners in one project, but indeed competitors in the next. So understanding this broader complex supply network arrangement, I think, is really important, because in order to develop cohesive and coherent positive cultures, we need to understand that we're working with different people and different groups, each of which will bring its own distinct values and beliefs to a project. So moving on to talk a little bit in detail about the work that we did do for the Australian Constructors Association, and this report, if anyone's interested, is available on the ACCA website as a free to download document. The ACCA asked us, as I said, in 2014 to actually undertake a review of culture as it impacted on workers' health and safety. So we did. We undertook a very large review, and we identified from the literature 9 core components of culture that impact on health and safety. So these 9 components are shown here in this diagram: leadership, goals and values, having a supportive environment, making sure that responsibility and indeed accountability for health and safety are appropriately dealt with, but having a learning culture that must mistakes happen, and we need to learn from those things that don't always work well. Ensuring that people have trust in the systems and the environment that they work in, communication, engagement, and resilience. So these are the 9 components, and each of these is described in considerable detail in the report. And I'm not going to go through all of them today, but I will touch on some of them as I talk about some of the research, because some of the research I want to show you actually does relate very strongly to these 9 components. I'd also like to just comment on the notion of leadership as being a really key facet of developing a culture that supports good health and safety. And indeed, in the construction industry, clients are ultimately the project leaders, because the clients create the context within which construction projects are delivered. They make a whole range of decisions about the delivery method, the commercial frameworks that underpin projects, the timelines, how much clients value health and safety, therefore, is very, very important. And clients demonstrating strong and positive health and safety leadership is a very important thing. And a good example of where this was done really well recently was the London Olympic Delivery Authority for the London 2012 Olympics, where they established health and safety as one of 7 core priority areas for the project. And they really drove through that whole program of work a very strong sense that health and safety were a very important aspect of delivering that complex program of works. So talking about engagement as being one of those components of organizational cultures, one of the pieces of work that we completed recently on behalf of the US National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health was to look at the way that decisions are made within projects, and specifically this research was focused on the design stage of construction projects. So we all know that designers now have some responsibilities for workers' health and safety, and it's become commonplace for projects to involve safety and design reviews, and to actually try and consider the way that design decisions can impact on workers' health and safety. But one of the things that we wanted to look at was who, how, and when those decisions that impact on health and safety are made, who's involved, when are the decisions made, and who gets a say in shaping some of those decisions. So we actually collected a lot of data from many projects, looking at the communication networks around decision making in the design stage. And we created these social network diagrams. The diagram you see in front of you is an example of one of those diagrams. Basically, the lines show the communication flows between the different parties, and the thickness of the line represents more communication. So the lines in the center of that particular diagram show that there was a lot of communication during the design stage between the design manager, the project manager, and the construction manager. Now, we did this over a lot of projects in both Australia and the USA, and we compared the results. And what we found was that across all of the projects, high quality health and safety outcomes were achieved when the construction team, the constructor, was actually in a central position in those networks. And indeed, there was a significant difference between the quality of health and safety outcomes depending on whether the constructor was central or not in those networks. So this was a particularly good case because the construction manager and the people who were actually involved in doing the construction work were really central to decisions that were made during the design stage. And we think that this is a good example of showing how there is a need to engage people who do the work in making decisions about how the work might be done. And indeed, it talks to the engagement component of the ACCA culture framework. The other thing that we did as part of that research was look at the way that different people see health and safety hazards and risks. And what was quite interesting early on was that we started to take lots of photographs of projects and look at different case studies using photographs, both in the US and here. And what we found when we showed these photographs to our industry participants who we were collecting data from was that depending on whether somebody was an architect, a constructor, an engineer, or a health and safety professional, they would often look at a photograph and see very different things in terms of health and safety hazards and risks. So in fact, in some examples that we showed people photographs of, people thought that the situation represented was very, very dangerous, whereas other people couldn't see any problems or hazards at all. And indeed, the nature of the hazards and risks that people observed were actually quite different, even within the professional groups. So we took this on board and we decided that this was actually probably something really important to learn more about. And we developed a tool called Do You See What I See, which actually gets people to look at photographs and talk through what it is they see, and then understand the perspective of other people who might see different things in the same images. And we think this is actually quite important because these differences and perhaps the inability to take the perspective of another person or another group can in fact be a real impediment to creating a shared mental model of health and safety in diverse and multidisciplinary project teams. So we think that this is a really useful way of actually helping project teams to get together early on in the life of a project to really understand different perceptions and different perspectives and manage this so that we can in fact develop shared mental models within project teams, and that will ultimately aid the delivery of a good health and safety outcome. And the last little bit of research that I would like to show you, or second last little bit of research I'd like to show you, is this data that we collected from a large road infrastructure construction project in Melbourne. Now, just as a bit of background, this project was delivered as an alliance, and it was a very, very successful project. This project had actually established health and well-being as a key result area, and they did a lot of very, very good work to drive health and well-being improvements in the life of the project. But this diagram here shows how project events and the broader project culture actually did impact upon workers' health and well-being over the life of the project. So if you look, the bottom axis shows the time. It shows weeks 1 to 21, and we collected data over this time period about the hours of work that people were putting in, about how they were experiencing work-life balance, and about their capacity to complete tasks at home and at work. And if you look particularly at the period from week 13 to week 17, the solid black line, that's the one that's not dashed, shows a steep rise in that period from week 13 to 17, and that's actually an indicator of how many hours people were working. So during that period, 13 to 17, the number of work hours per week, the average number of work hours, escalated dramatically. And at the same time, if you actually look at the other dotted lines, which measure satisfaction with work-life balance and capacity to complete tasks at home and at work, they fell almost in mirror image. So in fact, what we see here is the fact that the project, and just as a bit of background information, at week 17, there was a major milestone deliverable. So at week 17, a ramp was opening onto this particular section of road. Media were coming to do a launch and have a media event. And there was a lot of pressure on workers during that time. And you can see that the increase in work hours coincided with a plummet in work-life balance and capacity to complete tasks, particularly at home. And I guess I'm putting this up to show you the fact that in project events and broader project cultures can, even on projects where a lot of good work is being done around health and safety and health and well-being in this case, those project events and cultures around work hours and scheduling and expectations that people prioritize work over family life can in fact be quite damaging. And indeed, when we talked to people about their experiences, they were telling us that they had too much to do and not enough hours in the week. Time was flying by and they didn't achieve all they intended to achieve at the end of the day and carried a lot of it over, and actually came into work at 4 in the morning to try and get ahead. So, you know, these were the sorts of comments people were making when we asked them about those particular occurrences. And it's clear that there was actually a disconnect between the values that were being espoused relating to health and well-being and the people's lived experiences at the project. So going back to our Australian Constructors Association model of culture, this very much undermines trust in systems and in activities. If a project is focused on a key results area of health and well-being, but people are working in ways that are not sustainable and healthy, then that's a disconnect which will have a damaging impact on the culture. And lastly, the final bit of research I'd like to show you relates to some work that we've been doing in New Zealand in the construction industry there. And we've been measuring safety climate, which, as Tristan pointed out, is a related but slightly different concept to culture. But we've been measuring safety climate on a number of construction projects, and we've done this over time. So we've measured safety climate on 4 projects at 3 points in time and at 1 project in 2 points in time. And this shows the data that we've collected. So at the bottom, along the bottom of the graph here, is the percentage of project completion at which we undertook these surveys. And the surveys, each of the coloured lines represents the data that we collected at one of the 5 projects. And you can see that the safety climate perceptions, which are workers' perceptions that safety is a priority and that management are committed to safety at this project, those perceptions change over the life of the project. And in many of the projects, particularly Project C, the green line, and indeed Project B, the red line, the perception that safety is important declines as the project progresses towards completion. So I guess what this is telling us is we need to keep our foot firmly on the pedal and make sure that if we establish health and safety as an important project priority at the beginning of a project, we need to make sure that that is consistently applied throughout the life of the project, irrespective of what happens in relation to the project. So we don't want to see, for example, climates that deteriorate over time, as in Project B and C. The purple line on this graph is an interesting project because that's one at which, after the second survey, when the client realized that there had been a deterioration, slight deterioration in the safety climate, the client intervened and decided that they were going to implement a new program, which they termed Safety First, Schedule Second, Quality Third, I think. So basically it was a statement from the client that safety was the most important project priority. And that was done around and about 50% completion time for that particular project. And it's interesting to see that that's the one project where, in fact, between the second and the third surveys, the perceptions of the safety climate do, in fact, go up quite dramatically. So I think there's something to be learned from this graph, because often when we measure safety climate in construction projects, we maybe do it once at the beginning of the project or midway through. And what that doesn't give us is an understanding of how workers' perceptions of the importance of health and safety changes over the life of a project. And it can, in fact, change in significant ways that it's useful to know about. And that's it from me.
Great, thanks so much, Helen. Just listening to your research, it's obvious that the research questions that you're exploring are so relevant to industry. They're really connected to specific challenges and issues and context, as well as I think a lot of your research really translates neatly into some tangible actions that people can take. So you mentioned there this notion of the safety climate tool being a bit of a pulse check longitudinally over time. The project can measure that and see how they're tracking, as well as look at, do our interventions work? Has it resulted in an improvement in that overall safety climate? You mentioned too the distinction between the organisational and the safety culture, and something that I mentioned originally at the start of the presentation. I think for people listening, that they may not be on board that journey, or it's the first time they've heard that that statement. I suppose from my perspective, it's not so much we need to throw everything out that we know of safety culture. It's more, I think, just that we need to broaden our perspectives a little bit and just recognise that safety culture shouldn't be, isolated or separate to how we look at the organisation generally. What it can do is could set up some silos, perhaps where we have, health and safety. You're responsible for the safety culture part of our business, but we're responsible for this other part of the business. I mean, is there anything from your perspective there that people might be able to take away from that discussion? Any recommendations you have to reconcile that?
I agree with you. I think there's a real risk in treating safety culture as if it's something that can be bolted on to an organisation. It has to be integral to all aspects of the way that work is done. And I think it's quite interesting. I think in the more I experience from the research that we're doing, the more I'm seeing that health and safety are impacted most, not necessarily by the things that the health and safety professionals are doing, which are very constructive and useful and have a very positive effect, but the things that negatively impact health and safety are things that are being done as part of the operation of a business. And unwittingly, there is a health and safety impact. And that's something that I think we need to look at so that we can make health and safety a much more integrated part of the way that all business and project decisions are made within the industry. So when we think about clients procuring work, they need to think about health and safety in the process of doing it. When we think about managers deciding on work schedules, then we need to think about health and safety. And when we engage subcontractors and manage subcontractors, then there's also probably considerations around health and safety that need to be deeply embedded in the way that we do those other business activities.
Yeah, something that comes to mind is the whole literature around job insecurity. So a lot of work being done now to look at the threat of being laid off. How does that produce safety risks or different types of safety behaviour that the organisation didn't intend? One example being driving reporting underground, for example, or investing more effort to complete the job, but at the same time maybe engaging in additional shortcuts to make sure that productivity part of their role is really emphasised. So yeah, an interesting area, and we're getting better at understanding what's going on there. Thanks again, Helen. Now, Steve, we've got you on the line there too, and part of the session, or the whole series, in fact, is to make sure we get the industry perspective too, and hear about all the great things that you're doing in terms of applying culture and climate concepts to improve safety outcomes. So before we kick off a few questions that I have, would you mind just letting us know a bit about your role and your background there?
Yeah, sure, Tristan. Yeah, I've worked in construction for about 30 years now. I've travelled over in the Middle East and worked over there, and worked on quite a lot of very large construction projects and very tall structures in Australia. And the role here currently at Parklands is as a senior safety advisor. So we've got a team of safety advisors on site to support the construction team, and that's one of the key things that we do and that we strive to do, and that's provide support and advice and mentor the construction team as a whole. So a lot of what Helen was talking about there was just I had little lights going off all over the place, because there's so much of what Helen was talking about is what I've actually experienced in my time in health and safety and in construction. And there are so many key points that I took out of that discussion then, and so many things that are so relevant to that research. So yeah, really good research and really interesting and really relative, I think, to what's actually happening out there today.
Thanks, Steve. As you mentioned, I mean, was there maybe one key point in that presentation that you think really resonated with you, or the industry should take notice of?
I think one of the key points here was the perceptions, and the perceptions of people that gaining an understanding of the perceptions to be able to put some programs together to actually influence key managers in senior positions, and also set up a structure, to change the culture within your business. Safety, the absolute number one priority in what you do and everything you do, and that's something which we have actually done in the last 8 years, and made quite a lot of changes to make sure that safety is at the forefront of everything you do.
Yeah, great. Just a word out to the folks listening. If you do have questions either for Helen or Steve, now's a good time to start shooting those through while we chat with each other, and we'll try and get to those before we finish up. So if you are unsure, just go up to the top right-hand side, and there is a couple of boxes there, one being Q&A. Click on that and then type your questions into us, and we'll have a look at those. So Steve, you've obviously worked on a lot of different projects, large scale, international, before moving over to the Gold Coast. Now I understand there was one project where you did have some safety culture challenges, and Grocon sort of had an initiative there to really improve the safety on the site. Could you tell us a bit about this and some of the steps that you guys took to improve things there?
Yeah, sure, Tristan. Back in 2007, 2008, we won a substantial package of work up here in Queensland, and we hadn't established a business in Queensland at that stage, and the projects were very, very high profile, large projects in high profile areas, one in Brisbane, a couple down at the Gold Coast, and the one that I was actually assigned to down at the Gold Coast was a couple of towers, a 50-storey and a 40-storey tower, on a very large site, and these were some of the first projects we actually took on up in Queensland. So I suppose from a point of view of a business moving into a different region, there was a number of challenges that we had to overcome, not only obviously making sure that we could find the right amount of people that we wanted to work in our business, that were going to use the values that we had to drive what we needed to do, but just picking up in general the resources to do the work and putting together all that at once, as well as I suppose a very large change in the business in terms of where we wanted to go for safety were just some of the challenges that we had there. We had the systems in place, your standards, and we just gained a federal safety accreditation system there. But one of the things which I think was really important and which kicked off one of the major changes, within our business was our CEO. He wanted safety to be the absolute number one driver in the business, and he wanted everyone to actually think about it, to act it, to talk about it, and to put it in practice on the ground. There's lots of organisations out there, and there's lots of people out there that talk about safety, but it's really about getting it happening on the ground. And one of the key things that we did there was to partner with a safety professional organisation, and have that organisation come in and conduct some perception surveys. And the perception surveys were predominantly with our staff, and those perceptions and the data and the feedback we got from those perceptions were very important in driving the strategy to actually develop the safety culture that we have today. It was interesting to note that from that survey, one of the strongest perception that we got out of that survey was that the business tended to rely on safety professionals driving safety, and not so much senior management driving safety. And that was probably one of the key points that we got out of that perception survey. And it was very interesting because I think to develop a good safety culture, it's got to be developed top down, and it's got to be developed by your managers and from your managers. And the managers have got to be out there, and they've got to be walking the talk, and that's something that we needed to really happen on the ground to make safety an absolute priority in what we did. Some of the other things we did there from that perception survey, that allowed us to produce obviously a gap analysis of where we actually were at that point in time with our business and our people and the safety culture within our business. From there, you know, we set up a structure of committees. We identified obviously safety being an integral part of the business. It had to be out there. So safety was then put out there within our business as one of our 4 core values. And I think making safety your #1 core value, I think, is a very important step in putting that culture, developing that culture, and saying to people that yes, safety is going to be our #1 priority. And having that out there and those committees and those structures in place, part of the program that we then started to develop once we had that structure in place was a safety interaction program. And the safety interaction program, again, is a very, very important part of getting out there, talking to people, identifying what the issues are, understanding how people are actually doing their work, getting some feedback on how we actually perform as managers, and then sharing that interaction and that information back with our senior management teams through our different committees and through our different meetings and through our different interactions to make sure that you can get that cultural change that you really need to get happening in the workforce. And this isn't something which you can do in a short space of time. It does take some time, and you know, it's taking us on that particular project, which went for 3 years. We saw a dramatic difference in the perceptions and people's the way that they actually went about their business and identified safety risks and hazards, and started, you know, really talking about safety as the forefront of the business. It was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I liked your description, Steve. That made it feel quite straightforward and doable for many organisations to start to integrate a safety culture approach into what they're doing. I imagine, though, your role as, you know, an OHS person there in the field, influencing managers and trying to get buy-in and this process actually happening. Did you have any, maybe a lesson learned, or, you know, one sort of issue that tripped you up, and how did you deal with that?
Well, I suppose the major lessons learned is you've just got to keep pushing on. You know, at first when you bring in such a program and start to put these things out there, you do encounter a little bit of resistance. And you know, at the time we were coming into a new state with a business, so we had to put a lot of things together to make it work. We had staff coming from different states. We had people coming from different parts of Queensland, and part of that was to get all those people to actually work together and to get them all on the same page. That was an absolute challenge, and it still is a challenge. It's something which you've just got to continuously push at. You can't give up. You've got to keep going, and you can't let any negative criticism or anything that's you know, going to bring that program down. You've just got to keep going and not stop. And I think that's the most important thing.
Thanks for sharing, Steve. Look, we've had a few questions come through, which is great. Thanks for shooting those through from the audience. Steve, there is a specific one for you that I might just see if you could answer. So someone was asking about the diagram that Helen showed around the interconnectedness of the different stakeholders on the project. So the question was around the contractor being central to that design, the safety and design process. Is that something that GrowCon does? You know, can you sort of apply that model to how you work?
The safety and design process is, again, an absolutely integral part of making sure that when you design a building, the buildability of what you do is and the safe buildability of what you do, not only for when you're actually in the construction phase, but also when you've delivered the building to the client, and the maintenance aspects of the building. There's got to be a lot of thought put into that. You've got to think about all the different elements of construction when you're building and how you're going to build them, what risks you can eliminate, and elimination is always an absolute driver for the business in terms of making sure that we don't put people at risk, and ensuring that we get the message and communicate those changes that we have made through our different processes, and of course, you know, into the people actually out there building. So safety and design is absolutely integral to what you do, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as we're concerned. We put a lot of effort into it, and again, you know, we really pushed for an active safety and design culture within the business as part of this whole program, to make sure that we eliminate as many risks as we possibly can.
We've had a couple of questions come through along a similar theme. So the theme is around perhaps goal setting in terms of, you know, references to the zero harm approach of, you know, the types of safety goals that organisations set, and where those goals could actually work against what the organisation is trying to achieve. So maybe disengaging workers or leaders because they feel the goal is not achievable, or, you know, safety sort of espoused as a first priority, but the lived reality on the ground is something quite different. So I guess to either Steve or Helen, if either of you wanted to sort of respond to that idea of things you've seen out there, whether from a goal setting approach or just zero harm generally.
Helen, would you like to?
Oh, look, I have real reservations about the zero harm concept. I mean, I can see that it's obviously an aspirational concept, and, you know, obviously, you know, everything we do is about trying to prevent harm. But I think the concern for me is that it's an unrealistic expectation, probably, and in fact it may well alienate people who feel that it is unrealistic, and at the same time, setting it as a formal goal or an expectation, you know, may in fact create an environment where people feel that they can't report, recognise and learn from adverse events that do occur. And that's a really unhealthy state of play. So I don't have any direct experience of working in an organisation where that particular philosophy had been adopted, and I haven't done any specific research around it, but on a personal opinion level, I have reservations about its use.
Stephen,
I'd have to, yes. Well, I'd have to agree there, and I think, you know, when you set goals, I think you've got to be realistic, and you've got to make sure that you set achievable goals as well. And I think that's really important. If you sometimes if you set yourself goals that are unrealistic or unachievable, I think you pretty well set yourself up to fail sometimes. You know, and I think the milestone of actually achieving goals is an important thing as well. So, you know, to go from, I suppose, from one side of the story to I suppose from zero harm, I think, you know, sometimes is probably a bit too much. And again, I think, you know, from a personal level myself, I think the way we've gone about actually changing the culture within our business. You know, at first we did set some pretty big goals, but we didn't set unrealistic goals, and not using your I suppose your injury statistics as drivers, but seeing that worm or that graph actually gradually come down over a period of 5 or 6 years, to know that you are actually injuring far less people on your job sites, I think is a real measure of how you develop that safety culture and how you actually get it happening on the ground. So for me, zero harm is not a word that I like to use.
it really gets to the core of the philosophy of safety management in some senses, because you've perhaps got the safety one idea of it being about preventing, reducing, eliminating, and this perhaps new wave of thought which is more about approaching and promoting and trying to encourage more of the positive stuff, you know, so an emphasis on learning, emphasis on sort of inspiration and vision and motivating and engaging employees to sort of approach safety in some respects. So but we're sort of running out of time, but just give you both the opportunity. Are there any better messages that you think, you know, organisations in construction particularly could be perhaps setting or still selling to their workers around safety?
Well, I think the message that really needs to go out there is everyone needs to be proactive. Everyone needs to talk, to walk the talk and actually get out there and engage with their workforce, talk to them about safety, listen to what they've got to say. I think it's very important that a lot of people these days, they get out there and you know, they're talking away about it, but you've got to listen to the feedback from your workers and from the people who are actually doing the job. And if you can get that feedback and you can do something with it, and put some positive reinforcement into what you're actually doing, and the people can see that you are actually making a difference, I think that goes a long way to building up confidence within the workforce and really making, you know, a change in what you're doing. So, you know, that's what we're about, and that's what we strive to do.
Helen, any final messages you'd like to leave the audience with about today?
Well, look, I absolutely agree with what was just said. I think, you know, what the biggest thing for me is that we shouldn't try and control culture from the top down. It is actually something that emerges from the bottom up as well. And the ability to listen to and learn from the people who do the work seems to be key to being a really effective health and safety leader. I think people who do the work, again, my research has shown this, that the people who do the work understand it very, very well, and can often have really creative and innovative ideas as to how to do work better. And we need to look at, you know, their ideas for improving the way work is ultimately designed and done. I think that's an area that I'd like to pursue a lot more in my own research as well. I think it's a really important opportunity for improvement.
Yeah, and I remember your research around the empowerment of workers and, you know, helping them to videotape their work tasks, and obviously not describing it in good enough detail there, but you know, helping them to have an input into procedures and the learning process directly is sort of that bottom-up approach of building the culture from that ground level. Now, thanks both of you for being available today. I think we had a really useful discussion and talked about some key issues that obviously are relevant to safety professionals in the construction industry. We'll probably keep talking about the zero harm issue all day, but we'll sort of call it a day now. With the rest of the questions that have come through, thanks so much for getting involved. What we'll do is collate all those along with the questions from the other sessions, get the answers to those, and then post them up on the Safety Leadership at Work website. So just in closing today, I'm really thankful for our guests for being able to attend, as well as everyone in the audience there getting involved and listening to the presentation. As I mentioned, there are some additional resources that will be coming out as a part of this series. So some summaries, different guides around measuring safety, culture and climate in your business. They'll be up on the website in the next few weeks along with the recordings. So thanks again for coming along. This is session number 4 out of 5. So the last session is going to be coming up in 2 weeks' time. We're going to change the format just slightly. So what we're hoping to do is have more of an interactive discussion between perhaps the panelists as we go through the course of the presentation. So less slides and more just conversation about practical ways to actually go about measuring safety, culture and climate. So if you are sort of on the cusp of that journey, or maybe partway through and want to hear some advice, maybe about how to understand or interpret survey data or interview data, come along and we'll make sure that you have some practical takeaways from that next session. So thanks again and good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.